Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we're going to look at the women's movement. We're going to look at, well, not just the women's movement, but in the social movement, the counter-revolution of the 1960s. And before we do that, I'd just like to do a quick recap. And our last series of lectures covered the Vietnam War and the effects that the Vietnam War had on the Republic. So, we examined the history of the French and the Indochine or Indochina. How from the very beginning, from the first involvement of the French in the 1880s, there had been there had been a resistance to it. There had been sustained indigenous revolts or rebellions against French rule. They've mainly been quietly or quickly suppressed by the French, and the French had maintained power from the 1880s until early 1941, in which the French were forced out of the Indochine by the quickly rising Japanese Empire. The Japanese came in and they held it from, let's say, 1942 to 1945, being forced out due to their defeat, their collapse during World War II. And that the Japanese had proved to not just the peoples of Southeast Asia, but to all colonialized people, they had echoed in their conquest of the European colonies in the Far East, the Dutch East Indies, and of course the French Indochine, that a non-European army, modernly equipped and efficiently led, could defeat a European force in an even an open setting. They echoed the great victory of Ottawa, scored by Menelik II. They sort of echoed this sort of underdog's tale, one that would be buoyed, that would be picked up on and buoyed by future generations seeking to break colonial domination. Now, we also looked at the United States misconceptions and misinterpretations of Vietnam and the Vietnam War, mainly the fact that the United States and that the successive presidential administrations only viewed the conflict in Vietnam through the lens of a Cold War long-term strategy. And that the long-term strategy, of course, was containment of communism. No real thought was placed into using the history of Vietnam to sort of formulate a larger strategy. No thought was placed into using no long-term strategy was placed into structuring a peace that would be both acceptable to the communist and the non-communist governments of Vietnam. No long-term strategy was placed into really prosecuting the war to bring it to an end. As stated earlier in past lectures, it would have taken quite a significant commitment and force to bring the North Vietnam to heel. Now, we've spent quite a bit going over our recap, a bit more time than I would have liked to. So we're just going to dive right into the counter-revolution, the women's movement, and the counter-movements of the 1960s. So to begin with, let me just say that the generation of women who came after the generation of World War II had to be seen as the most privileged generation of women up to that point. Nevertheless, many felt that they were not living up to their potential in terms of educational abilities. Certainly, they had a vast array of material wealth and social resources that dwarfed all previous generations. such a better access to food, medical care, creature comforts. For those women who had college degrees, they felt that they were being artificially hemmed in by social distinctions that were rooted in 19th century, if not earlier, gender ideas or biases about gender that did not make sense to them in the mid 20th century. In their modern era, these sort of distinctions did not seem logical or reasonable to them. Um, The argument is best illustrated by Betty Friedan's 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, and in particular, the chapter entitled The Problem That Has No Name. Betty Friedan had been a student at Smith College, and she had graduated in the class of 1942. She came from a very privileged background. After her marriage, she had kept up with a few of her college friends, and she found that many of them were stifled and disappointed regarding their lives as full-time moms. Now, these women found that they had to live vicariously through others while their partners enjoyed this full life outside of the home. Many of her friends were also dependent on tranquilizers and other sedatives that were quickly becoming fashionable and indispensable to get through their days, to get through the monotony of their days. The women that Friedan was referencing were mothers of these large baby boom broods. Friedan's arguments also lobbied for these women to have the opportunity to work and find fulfillment outside of the home and outside of mothering. The opportunity to engage in complex and challenging work was also a motivating factor for Friedan. And Friedan also raised the point that women who married young often had all their children in school by the time they were in their early 30s. And they had to look forward to another half century of life with nothing really stimulating to look forward to other than this life has been seen solely as a mother and like a caretaker to a husband. At this point, it was entirely legal to discriminate and hire practices against all groups. One of the most interesting things that I like to do is I like to point out to students job advertisements from before 1964, where they often use acronyms to single out what groups they wanted for a particular job. It's funny. It's funny to think about it now, and something that doesn't really quite catch on immediately for them, but those jobs were literally segregated by gender, ethnicity, and in some cases age. And in some cases age for prospective applicants. And it was all entirely legal. It was also very legal to discriminate with regard to pay between the sexes and the ethnicities. That is, to pay members of ethnic minorities, ethnic racial minorities, less money than members of the ethnic majority, or to pay women less than males, even though these ethnic majorities or these women would have been performing the same duties as their male counterparts. It's also important to note that Friedan was aiming towards and addressing a middle class audience, a middle class and above audience, and to be completely fair and honest, we should note that in addressing this middle class audience, she was not addressing a lower middle class or a solid middle class audience. She was addressing an upper class and an upper middle class audience. The book wasn't really designed for everybody. All right. And to sort of further on that point, the numerically greater women of the working class had always had to work throughout the history of the republic. In our earlier lecture on the women's movement of the 19th century, that was borne out. Those women had to work. There wasn't a choice of being fulfilled or seeking some sort of enjoyment outside of the household. This was, we're all going to starve unless everybody pitches in, unless everybody has a job, unless everybody who can contribute contributes. So there's also that factor to sort of take along when we're discussing this, when we're discussing this topic. In the years following World War II, women, particularly lower class women, working class women, as it's called, they have found employment opportunities for the first time in decades and years. They languished during the Depression, and now they had these new opportunities to earn incomes for themselves and their families. For these women, their choices of continued employment was, again, not a personal desire, but it was born out of very real economic necessity. Their position stands in stark contrast with Friedan and her sort of social class, her sort of social circles stance or position on this, to where they want jobs and they want opportunities outside of the household for personal development, for purely, I guess, psychological, well, not really psychological, yeah, we will. I'll just continue with for personal fulfillment of their own desires of having a career, and not out of the dire economic necessity of women from lower middle class or working class backgrounds. And this also meant that women who never married or became divorced were at a severe economic disadvantage. We also have to put them into this perspective as well. For women who never married, who never found a husband, who always had to work for themselves, they were consistently at an economic disadvantage because women were paid significantly less than males for doing the same counterpart, for doing the same job, and they were also sort of boxed out. They were always sort of like fenced out of higher paying jobs, or receiving the ability to work towards higher paying jobs. And then, of course, divorced women were also at this disadvantage because they had to go out there and find work, where many of them may not have been particularly well skilled to go out there and find work. Now, John Kennedy appointed a commission on the status of women in the Republic in 1961, headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, who in the years since 1945, since her husband's death, had established herself as one of the great standard bearers of 20th century liberalism in the United States. The report delivered by the Commission in 1963 found that women were indeed discriminated against in jobs, work wages, and of course in legal matters. As late as the 1960s, some states did not let women sit on juries or write their wills. To give you a sort of like counteract to that, as late as the 1960s, nationally, if a woman, a wife, a mother, if a woman was to go into a department store and want to make a purchase using a store card, or to put a purchase on a store account, she would have to have to tell somebody on the floor. That person would then usher her into a waiting room, and after ushering her into a waiting room, that person would then go ahead and call the husband to okay the purchase, to make sure that that she had permission to make this purchase, and if she didn't have permission, then she wouldn't have been allowed to make the sale. You still had these sort of restrictions on it, on the economic freedom of women, so to speak. This report also found that women, much like civil rights movement, took aim at these, took notice and internalized these social injustices, and the later women's movement would really try to strike down these social injustices. Now, the women's movement began as a procedural organization, but gradually picked up more radical overtones. Now, Friedan was a key figure in the National Organization of Women, better known as NOW, which was founded in 1966, and NOW campaigned for the complete abolition of gender discrimination in employment. They argued that jobs that excused women from consideration were not the jobs that required physical strength, but rather intellectual strength. And there was no adequate reason for women to be excluded since they had the same intrinsic intellectual capabilities as men. A very sound and compelling argument. Gradually, legislation through Congress did begin to include clauses that banned gender discrimination and stipulated equality between the sexes. In an interesting, if not ironic, turn of events, Southern congressmen were known to speak out sarcastically against legislation aimed at countering ethnic discrimination by joking that if this passes, soon we'll have laws banning gender discrimination. Now, irritable jokes, jokes like that would later be incorporated into the legislation indeed, and this resulted in the sharp rise in the number of women in the workforce in professional jobs during the 1960s. This was, and that is jobs, but what I mean by professional jobs is I mean to say jobs where that were high profile and had previously been all male, that had been sort of WASP male dominated fields, such as corporate boards and politics, particularly politics. There had already been a few female members of the House of Representatives, but there hadn't really been a whole lot of female staffers. And you begin to see this sort of opening up of opportunities along all these fault lines in society due to this great push, and also this very gender-friendly legislation. Later, major corporations will come under increased pressure to integrate women into their workforce, and they began to behave the same way. Had the segregationists have reacted to the demand to integrate the different ethnicities in local public life. They used tokenism as their policy. They would hire one woman in a senior capacity, often in publicity, so that they could reel in the social benefits of having a woman represent the company, to having a woman be there as the representatives of the company were being displayed so that they can point her out. And in much the same way, this sort of tokenism was explored and exploited by leaders of the civil rights movement. They would often lobby to have African Americans hired, and when the corporations would hire African Americans, they would be they would be hired to perform the same function. They would have no real power, no real authority within the corporation, but they would be reeled out whenever there was a press event or some sort of press junket or circuit, so that it could be illustrated, so that it can be shown that they were inclusive, that the corporation was inclusive. Now, Gradually, the principle of routine hiring of women in professional jobs became the standard. And by the 1980s, the most sacrosanct areas of the Republic were being challenged and integrated along gender lines. During the Reagan administration, Sandra Day O'Connor was chosen as the first female Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And in 1984, Geraldine Ferrara, she was chosen as the running mate of Walter Mondale. She became the first female to be nominated as a vice presidential candidate by any of the major parties. Childcare. Now, as women were being increased into they were increasingly entering into the world of employment. Childcare became one of the great new questions, one of the great obstacles that was raised to bar their sort of entry, to sort of delay it. And the great question was that was asked was this: if a mother is going to work, what are her children going to do? Specifically or especially the preschool age children. Childcare then and now remains a hotly debated and often controversial issue. Many questions have been raised about this, but none have been fully answered, and none of the issues have been fully decided. Such as is the government responsible for providing affordable child care? Was it an employer's obligation to meet child care needs? Was looking after children a woman's job, or is it gender neutral? In the mid-1960s, the women who were working in the civil rights and the anti-war movement, they also became very critical of gender discrimination. And this was discrimination that they encountered from their own comrades working in these same movements. In 1968, during a student uprising at Columbia University, the student radicals occupied the university's administration building until the university met their demands. Now, while that was going on, a group of them, a group of female students, soon found that it wasn't long before they were being asked to perform housekeeping duties such as cooking or cleaning for the occupiers by their male comrades. They then posted a sign that read, "Free women don't cook," and insisted upon the equal sharing of all of these housekeeping duties. Their aim was not just to alter the Republic's social constructs or conceptions regarding who would be sent off to fight in a war, but also who was allowed to sit or use public facilities. Their aims included altering the entire social understanding, the entire social construction of the Republic, and combating what they deemed sexism. And sexism is a play on the word racism had applied to gender. They did this by conducting consciousness-raising workshops where they designed this program, this intellectual program, to overcome women's self-delusion. This was a very real and a very unusual component of feminism. The feminist leaders very often had to persuade other women that they were or had been the victims of sexual discrimination, even if the other women didn't feel as though they were the victims of such discrimination. Now, conscious raising workshops struck many as odd, as normally you don't have to persuade someone that they're the victim of persecution. And we will break here. The lecture's running on a little bit. We'll break here, and we will come back with part 2 of our look into these to the women's movement and to the counterculture revolution movements of the 1960s and early 70s. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. And I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time as we continue our discussion.